Well, I think if we're ready, we'll get started. So welcome everyone again to today's webinar for Best Results Rubrics. Excited to have everyone here and learn a little bit more about all of this. And we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Haley Diaz, the host for today's event. And we'll also have Dan Thompson, who's over here too. He's our marketing manager, and he'll just be joining us in the background to answer any questions that anybody might have in regards to rubrics throughout the presentation. So before we get started, let's just knock out some Zoom logistics. So the presentation will be recorded and it will be distributed to all attendees within the next 24 hours. And there are a couple of Zoom features that we'll be using today and love your participation in them. The Q&A feature will just be for any questions that we might have for our presenter, Austin, today. And I'll see those and then share them with him, and he'll answer them in the Q&A part at the end of the presentation. And if we don't get to your individual question, Austin or Dan will make sure to follow up with you individually after the presentation. And then the chat feature will just be used for general inquiries. Just feel free to post anything in there you might like to share with the rest of the group. And we'll also be tweeting during all of this. So if you want to get social, we're here for it. And so with that all taken care of, we'll just get started. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's host, Austin Rutledge. With more than a decade of experience working in education and with a Master of Science in Education from the University of Tennessee, Austin is passionate about working to improve student outcomes at every level of education. Austin has taught at every level from middle school to university courses and has spent the last 4 years working alongside faculty in every possible setting, from primary grade classrooms to medical school laboratories, in an effort to increase student engagement and improve retention. And while much of Austin's experience lies in technology integration, his focus is always on finding the right pedagogical approach, regardless of the role technology might play. And so with that, I'm happy to turn things over to Austin.
All right, thank you, Haley. I appreciate that. I really am very passionate about pedagogy and finding, as Haley said, finding the right tool for the right situation. Oftentimes, technology does play a role in what we're doing in education these days, especially in the world of classes on Zoom. I spent the last semester teaching classes on Zoom as well, and figuring out what that was like to have a live student, live class of students who are, sorry if you hear any background noise. I'm at home like everyone else with kids around too. So, I have spent, like I said, the last semester working with students live online. And so there definitely are challenges to that. And I know that, finding the right technological tool for the right situation is important. And so today, as Haley said, our focus today is all about rubrics and what rubrics are, how do you make rubrics, and how you can use them, especially in the world of health sciences education. So with that being said, specifically breaking down our objectives for today, we want to look at the components of a rubric, what a rubric is and what goes into making a rubric, as well as looking at the best uses of rubrics in various settings. And then, thinking about ways that you can work with your team of people at your institution to develop rubrics for assessments of students or assessments of faculty or both. Or even assessments of courses. So there's lots of different ways rubrics can and are being utilized across the world of higher education today. So with that being said, what is a rubric? When I say rubric, what am I talking about? I know a personal story, my own experience in my graduate education, I was using rubrics to assess how well students were learning in a geography classroom, utilizing certain tools. And when I talked to my advisor in the geography department at the University of Tennessee, that he was a little bit unsure of what is this thing called a rubric? I've never utilized a rubric before. And so he definitely had a little conception of what this tool is. Now, coming with a background in education, I was very familiar with them, but not everyone is, and so I think it is very important to describe that. And so, rubric literally means read in Latin, and so that really that goes back to the Middle Ages, and at that point in time, people would when they gathered, they would have these liturgical services, and there were certain rules that people had to follow, and the guidelines or the rules for those services were literally written on the wall in red. And so it was, the red writing on the wall was the rubric, and so a rubric is literally a guideline or rules or step-by-step process that you follow to achieve success. And so thinking about that in today's educational world, here is an example that you might see of a very, very basic rubric. Now, this is a rubric that I have worked with educators in the primary grades, as you can imagine, to utilize rubrics to assess students. And it was great because those students, they knew what a smiley face was and they knew what a frowny face was. And so being able to get that type of feedback on their performance or on whatever product it was that they were being asked to complete was so helpful for them, because they could say, okay, I didn't do very good on my my creativity, or whatever it was, whatever those components or criteria are for the rubric. They could break that down and think about, okay, where can I get better, and where can I kind of move that across and get that big smiley face at the end. So here's an example that's probably a little bit more relevant to you all in the world of higher education. And this is an example of what we'll talk about later as an analytic rubric. And so an analytic rubric is one like this, is really going to break things down. And so now you can see where that frowny face is, the needs improvement category, as well as that big smiley face in that excellent column. And so as you can see here, we're not just giving them, smiley faces. We're really breaking down all of the criteria and what it means to succeed in this example, communication skills. So this example does come from the National Board of Medical Examiners, and a document that they published about how to develop, in this case, a rating scale or checklist. They talk about checklists a lot too. But in this case, I adapted one of their rating scales to fit within a rubric. And I'm a big fan of rubrics as opposed to checklists. And so, if you are assessing a student's communication skills and their interaction with a patient, and you can see the thing that I really like about this rubric is you have, this criteria here, the communication skills, and then it's really breaking down each component of that criteria. So, in terms of interrupting the patient, do they ever interrupt the patient? How often do they interrupt the patient? Also here with using jargon and explanations that they use with patients. Again, you can follow that across the rubric to see, how they're utilizing that in terms of their communication with the student. And what's great about this is that it makes the tool, the assessment tool, so much more objective. You're not relying on the evaluator to just say, okay, communication skills, scale of 1 to 5, how did they do? No, you're really breaking it down and forcing that evaluator to think about that student's performance. And so here in this case, that they checked this box where it was good. And there's definitely, I would encourage you in utilizing rubrics with your faculty, with your students even, that there's some training that goes into this, that you explain how do we use this tool and how do you use a rubric like this to evaluate communication skills. What do all these columns mean, and how do you determine where you place that check mark? And again, going down here with you could add multiple components, multiple criteria to a rubric so that you can assess them on multiple facets of in this case, an objective structured clinical examination, or OSCE, encounter with a standardized patient. And so that's one example of a rubric that's probably a lot more relevant to you all than just the happy faces and smiley faces, although those are pretty fun. Just to talk a little bit about rubrics, I read this great chapter from a book published by the ASCD. That's the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. They've been around for years and years, and their focus really is on sound pedagogical tools that are utilized in curriculum development. And so when they write about rubrics, I just pulled out a number of quotes that I think really speak to why rubrics are important and why rubrics should be utilized in educational settings. And again, going back to something I mentioned earlier, rubrics can be used to assess products. So, you could use a rubric to assess a paper that a student wrote. You could use a rubric to assess a presentation that a student gives, or maybe a video that they create, or whatever kind of product, something that they produce. But you can also use rubrics to assess performance, and I think that is where they can be extremely helpful, especially in in medical education and in health sciences education, because students are often asked to exhibit and perform and showcase their skills with regards to what they've learned and how they can put it into practice. And so what's great about rubrics here, and you see this quote, is that rubrics really do clarify for the student what is expected of them. I have seen many times on course evaluations of students evaluating a course or students evaluating faculty, and students talk about how they weren't really sure what the expectations were. And so when that happens, we need to go back and think about our communication with the students. And also, in terms of assessing performances, rubrics really can serve as that communication tool to explain to students, this is what we expect. This is how we expect you to perform on this assessment, or in this situation, or in this setting. So they really are clarifying for students. Another quote that I pulled out from that chapter was that rubrics also are great for teachers. They help teachers focus on the learning as opposed to a checklist. I've talked about checklists before. I'm not a big fan of just utilizing checklists for things like standardized patient encounters, those OSCE situations, or even in a clinical setting in the clinical years where students are being evaluated with patients. I'm not a big fan of checklists. I like rubrics for those situations because they really break down the different criteria, and it's more of a focus on learning, not just did I do this. It's more of okay, what can I do to get better? What is expected of me, and where do I fall on this scale, and kind of where am I going from there? And then I also thought it was interesting how they talked about rubrics being used repeatedly over time. And this really kind of gets to the idea of growth mindset that Carol Dweck was really instrumental in developing this idea of a growth mindset. But if you're utilizing rubrics to see student growth over time, then you should use those rubrics repeatedly. And so, students should get used to seeing the same instruments over and over so that they are able to see growth over time. And so I would encourage you, if you make use of rubrics in your curriculum, that you find ways that you use them repeatedly. At least, the rubric that itself might not be used repeatedly over time, but perhaps the specific criteria. So, you might have a rubric that has those communication skills, but maybe it's paired with different criteria in different settings. And that's okay, but I would encourage you that at least the components, or, the indicators for telling you, are they doing a good job with the communication skills, keep that consistent over time so that students are able to assess themselves and see growth. And then last, I think this is extremely important, going back to that idea of a growth mindset. It really does show students what their next steps are. Students really do want to get better, especially in professional schools and a professional education. The students that I've always worked with, I can tell the students really do strive to do their best. They're the cream of the crop already. And so, utilizing these rubrics, students are immediately, and I know a lot of people are this way, when they see a rubric that shows them, the 1 point, this is where you are, this is not so good, the frowny face, or the really smiley face, people's eyes are immediately drawn to, okay, what do I have to do to be the best? And so I think that's really important to show students, you're not there yet, but you have opportunity to continue to grow and to continue to develop. So with that being said, I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about the different kinds of rubrics. And so what you see here is what you might refer to as a holistic rubric. And so a holistic rubric is a little bit different than what I showed you earlier. And a holistic rubric, you kind of wrap everything up into one statement. So for example, all of those different criteria, not just communication skills, but all of the criteria that you might use to assess a student in an OSCE encounter would be wrapped up into one single statement. So we've got this score backwards here, but you can see that the beginning level of performance might be a 1. So switch these around, but you're going to describe for the evaluator, what did they have to do to get a 4? What did they have to do to get a 1? And so this graphic might actually help a little bit. This is from Jennifer Gonzalez, who is really knows rubrics really well. I've cited her work here, and thinking about something as simple as breakfast in bed. What goes into a great breakfast in bed experience. And so is the food prepared well? Is the presentation of the food well? Maybe they put a little vase of flowers and some garnishes on the plate, or something like that. They surpassed expectations, as well as they kept the recipient of that meal comfortable while they were eating breakfast. And so you can see, there's multiple components all wrapped up into that one single statement. And the evaluator really only has the option to select a single score for all of those things. So holistic rubrics do have a lot of advantages, and that they are potentially a lot more efficient. They're easier to design because you're not breaking things down. They are more, like I said, more efficient for the evaluator because they can really look at a single statement and make a decision. However, in many cases, in some cases at least, a holistic rubric has some disadvantages because you aren't breaking things down. It's could be more difficult to utilize. Maybe the food was prepared really well, but I wasn't kept comfortable throughout the meal, and so that might be really hard to determine what score to give the person you're evaluating here. So opposed to a holistic rubric, we have an analytic rubric, and this is what you saw earlier. And this is where you are going to break down those criteria, those different criteria or components that you're assessing. And you're going to determine, what does it mean to need improvement? What are the indicators that we want to put in here? And, how do those change when we get to the excellent, category or excellent column? And so here you can imagine going back to our example of breakfast in bed, an analytic rubric, you might have very well prepared food, but maybe the tray, napkin, or silverware is dirty, it's missing, something's not right there. So, maybe they're not doing so well with terms of presentation, and then comfort, they could fall anywhere on that scale as well. And so there's a different way to evaluate the students on individual criteria. So kind of a spin on the idea of an analytic rubric is what is called a single point rubric. And so a single point rubric does, again, break down those different criteria. So using our example of breakfast in bed again, you have food, presentation, and comfort. And so the evaluator is able to assess, where they are. Are they advanced in each of these areas, or is it an area of concern? And so not as many levels. You're not describing each level of performance. You're leaving that up to the evaluator. What's really important with single point rubrics like this is that the evaluators provide lots of narrative feedback. That narrative feedback is critical in this case because otherwise all the student is going to get is I'm advanced or I have an area of concern. And so that is definitely something that is important. And so when you are utilizing and determining which type of rubric you're going to use and how you're going to utilize those rubrics, it's important to train those people who are evaluating. And then also, I would encourage you to train the people being evaluated in how to use that rubric to assess themselves as well. I'm a big fan of self-assessment and self-reflection. In fact, I have worked with some schools who have adopted the approach of having students complete a self-reflection or a self-assessment utilizing a rubric in those OSCE encounters before they ever even see their scores from the actual evaluator. Their scores, that matter, that go into the grade book. But before they ever see those, they have to reflect on their own performance. And it's really interesting to see how those self-assessments compare to the evaluator's assessments. So one more version of that single point format kind of breaks things down a little bit more than the previous example I showed you, but still this is very, very dependent upon feedback and narrative comments. And so, for example, you have these different categories or these different criteria, and then the evaluator can determine, are you beginner, developing, accomplished, or exemplary, or, use your own terminology, but they can determine which box they want to check, and then they can provide comments. It's still not, you're still not really giving them all the information. You're not breaking things down, but you are giving them the ability to more subjectively determine where the student might fall. And so here you do, for the criteria, you do want to at least describe what mastery means. That will help the evaluator determine where they are on that scale. And again, like I said, narrative feedback is critical here. So I want to go back real quick. I'm going to go back to this analytic rubric. And I know I've seen some examples, and I'm going to show you an example in a little bit of how you could utilize this to assess things like an EPA or the core EPAs that were developed by the AAMC, the Entrustable Professional Activities, EPAs. And so you can imagine just thinking about EPA number 1, which is really focused on the student in the medical world of students gathering a history and performing a physical exam. As you can imagine, if we've all been to the doctor, that's pretty important, right? For the doctor to be able to take your history and to examine you physically if you're having some type of ailment. And so there are certain components or criteria that go into that. First of all, gathering the history. How does a student, what behaviors do they exhibit to obtain that accurate history in an organized way? And then also their patient interview skills. Are they respectful of the patient? Do they, consider patient privacy and things of that nature? And do they empathize with the patient in those conversations? And so those are really important things to consider, as well as, another criteria that the AAMC lists or talks about is their clinical reasoning skills. And then going beyond that, the actual physical examination, is it appropriate for the purpose of that visit? And so, instead of food, presentation, and comfort, you might have history, interview skills, clinical reasoning, and physical examination. And so you might break those down into different, categories and assess those based on the information the AAMC has provided with their core EPA documentation. So I would encourage you, if that's something you're interested in with regards to assessing EPAs, is to go and look at that documentation on the AAMC's website. And they've got a lot of information already really kind of organized for you that you can really just adopt or adapt to your instruments that you want to utilize at your institution. So let's talk about some other uses for rubrics. We talked about OSCEs, those objectively structured clinical examinations. Also, thinking about health sciences education, things like case presentations or clinical problem solving, those types of scenarios where students might be working in small groups to solve a case or solve a problem. Problem-based learning, is another example. And I would encourage you too to think about, uses for, these rubrics, not just using them to assess the students, but like I mentioned earlier, having students assess themselves in those situations. And potentially, if they're working in small groups, you can utilize those same rubrics and have students assess their their peers, the people that they're working alongside in these groups. And so lots of potential for that. If a student is working through a problem-based learning activity and they're meeting with faculty in multiple sessions throughout the week, or a facilitator multiple times throughout the week, meeting with their groups or working individually to learn what they need to solve this clinical problem, then at the end of that, utilize those rubrics to have them assess themselves, assess their peers, and make sure that they do those things before they get any feedback on the facilitator assessment of the individual students. I think that is powerful. Students, that reflective piece. And if you've been to one of my webinars before, you've probably heard me quote John Dewey, that we learn not, our learning doesn't happen from doing something, it's from reflecting on what we've done. And so that's really important, that reflection piece, and rubrics can be a great way to encourage self-reflection. So more uses for rubrics that I wanted to mention today. Number one, clerkship evaluations. I know students, when they are rotating in the second and the third years of medical school, or in the clinical year of their physician's assistant programs, or whatever type of health science program they're in, there's probably some type of clinical component to that curriculum. And students might have rotations or internships that they complete. And so oftentimes during that period of the curriculum, students are going to be evaluated in some shape, form, or fashion. And rubrics are a great way to objectively structure those evaluations. So often evaluations consist of multiple open-ended questions, which aren't terrible, but lend to a lot of subjectivity based upon the evaluator. And if you've ever done research on, how evaluators can differ from one location to another, or from even the same evaluator differing with different students, there's a lot of subjectivity involved. And so to make those evaluations as fair and as accurate as possible, we need to structure them objectively. And so rubrics are a great way to do that. And then I mentioned EPAs as well. We talked about how you could utilize a rubric to assess various EPAs, the core EPAs as published by the AAMC. Okay, one final thought that I really want to leave you with is this idea of a developmental rubric. And a developmental rubric is essentially a rubric similar to what I have talked about before with the analytic rubrics, but it's really more about the way that it's used, and that you are focusing on student growth over time. So you are going to be using rubrics repeatedly, and you're at least going to be using those criteria repeatedly, maybe breaking them down from one performance or assessment or assignment to another. But the focus really is there on growth, not necessarily on student grades. And so that there's lots of narrative feedback that go along with those rubric assessments as well. And so I left an example here of an individual who utilized these developmental rubrics to really enhance student learning in their educational program. So kind of wrapping up a little bit, I want to talk about rubrics in Leo. As Haley mentioned, I do work for DaVinci Education, and our learning management system, Leo, does utilize rubrics in our evaluations. And as you can see in the video here that's playing, you can assign those rubrics to an evaluation. And the way it works in Leo is it's very flexible, and that you can take multiple components of a rubric, and you can build those all out as separate questions, so that you really have a large assessment tool that you can utilize with students. Or if you want to, you could break it down and have a single rubric if you want to use a holistic rubric. If you want to use those single point rubrics and you just have, the advanced or the area of concern, and then you have that comment box. As you can see in this video here, there's that comment box where the facilitator, or sorry, the evaluator can provide that narrative feedback that's so important to go along with that rubric assessment. So again, the key in Leo is that rubrics are very flexible, and that allows you to really design them the way that you need and the way that you need to assess your students. And so I would encourage you to do that with your students in mind. So designing rubrics, kind of thinking about this last topic that I want to touch on. When it comes to designing rubrics, I really encourage you not to necessarily do this by yourself. There is a lot to be said for working in groups and the power of more than one mind working together. But there's kind of some best practices here that I would encourage you to utilize. First of all, think about the use for your rubric. What are you using the rubric for? And then think about what type of rubric that's best suited. Maybe in some cases that holistic rubric really is all you need. But once you've done that, work on creating a rubric draft. If you need to develop all those different indicators for various criteria that show you what's developing versus what's mastery level and so forth. And then after you do that, I would encourage you, even though you're working together, I would encourage you to break apart, go your separate ways, and then self-assess the product that you have created. And it's kind of ironic, but there are actually multiple examples of rubrics to assess rubrics. And so a little bit of rubric inception there, if you will. But utilizing a rubric to evaluate your own rubric that you've designed will help you to be objective in that and kind of remove the subjectivity that you might have and determine, do you need to adjust something so that assessment tool is as good as it can be? And there are definitely best practices. I've put some information here on the screen, some URLs of different places. I know Arizona State, that second URL there, they have actually, their work has been cited quite a bit in terms of rubric development and rubric design. I'm going to exit my presentation here, and I do have on here an example of what a rubric modified from that Arizona State rubric, what that looks like. And so this was that first link that I listed on that screen. And so here you can see their criteria is the clarity of the criteria in your rubric, distinction between levels, reliability, clarity of expectations, support of metacognition. I'm a big fan of metacognitive awareness, thinking about how you're learning. And then, are you engaging the learners in the development of that rubric? I think that's something that could be very helpful as well. And so think about how you might utilize and get feedback from the people you are assessing and how their feedback might inform the creation of that rubric. All right. So going back to our slide deck, once you've had that opportunity to self-assess those rubrics, I would encourage you to come back together, take the feedback that each of you have individually, and use that to create that ultimate final revision of that assessment tool that you want to utilize for your students. So the last thing I want to leave you with is this statement, just that rubrics do improve outcomes. There's multiple studies that have supported this statement, and I would encourage you all to think about how you can utilize rubrics in your programs at your institution to more objectively assess students, to get better, provide better feedback for students, and really shift the focus from discrete tasks that students need to complete to the learning that we know will make them better healthcare providers in the future. So that is all I have for today. I'm going to leave these sources. I've got another slide. I'll leave this up for just a few moments in case anybody wants to grab a quick screenshot. And then I believe we'll probably have these slides posted along with the recording this video that I know Dan will work on making sure that you guys have access to that. With that being said, I want to open it up to questions. And I know, Haley, you've been working with Dan to keep track of those.
Yes, sir. So thanks again, Austin. That was so incredible, very informative, very engaging. So yeah, we did have a couple questions roll in through the Q&A in the chat. So the first one was from one of our attendees, and they said, I'm thinking about suggesting that my PA faculty do a peer review of each other since they are mostly new to teaching. Do you think using a rubric could be a useful tool for that?
Yes, definitely. I would encourage you, especially when you are, when it comes to evaluating faculty. And I've kind of been in that situation before, and I know sometimes it might be a little bit uncomfortable evaluating each other at that level. And rubrics can really take away, like I mentioned, they take away some of the subjectivity. And so when you are, if you just have a list of open-ended questions to respond to when you're evaluating other faculty, even if they're peers, even if you're not a supervisor evaluating someone you supervise, having a rubric as that tool that you can say, okay, I observed, your lecture or your lesson the other day, your small group activity with your students, whatever it might have been. And, I utilize this rubric that, our institution has adopted. And this is where I feel like you fell in regards to these different criteria. And because the criteria, especially if it's an analytic rubric, because those criteria are so well defined, then that can really maybe take away any kind of awkward, situations or uncomfortable conversations that you might have otherwise. I know sometimes people get a little bit, protective of themselves when they're being evaluated. And so rubrics can really help to make it more objective and maybe make the conversation a lot more comfortable for both people being evaluated.
Oh, thank you, Austin. That was really solid. Another question that rolled in was, how do students get rubric results and feedback in Leo?
Oh, great question. So I'll go back to that slide. So yes, so as you can see here, rubrics are designed in Leo to be very flexible. Like I said, they can be displayed on mobile devices of all kinds. But once those evaluations are submitted, then students have access to that feedback once it's approved in their academic portrait. And so you can work with your institution to determine how that approval process works. Leo has great tools to streamline that process so that you can go in and you can approve those evaluations in bulk if needed, and students can then get access to those in their academic portrait. And so I know some of you may or may not be familiar with the academic portrait in Leo, but that's a component of Leo that students have access to that is, kind of all about them and their academic journey. And so that includes their evaluations. And so if you go to our website, www.davinci-ed.com, we do have some information on there about the academic portrait, which is, like I said, where the students can get a lot of these narrative comments and their feedback. And I do also want to point out, I know this is sometimes a concern, is that the evaluations that students see there are summary evaluations. They, depending upon settings that you choose, you can have faculty names be visible or not visible. And then if they're being evaluated by multiple faculty, they actually see a summary evaluation so they can see kind of the aggregate of where they stand with regards to that evaluation.
Thank you. If you want to ever learn more about the academic portrait or evaluations in Leo, I know Dan just posted a link in the chat. So if you want to schedule a meeting with us, we're happy to discuss more. Now, Austin is very much about that. So thank you. Another question that rolled in was, we have a tough time with consistency across faculty in grading practical activities. Do you have any tips to help improve inter-rater reliability when using rubrics?
Yes, so that's good. I'm glad that inter-rater reliability was brought up. I think some of the research that I have seen actually shows that rubrics will increase that reliability as opposed to just utilizing checklists, like I talked about before. Checklists can be very subjective. If you have a checklist item that says that the patient took a history, accurately and, however you want to describe it, and the answer is yes or no, then that really leaves it up to the evaluator to say, well, they took the history, but they didn't ask the right questions, or they, really gathered excessive data, incomplete data, or not the right, they didn't ask the right questions. There might have been some things that were concerning. And so they might check no, even though technically the student did take a history. And so rubrics, make that more objective and define better for those evaluators where the student would have fallen. And so you'll actually see more, typically the studies that I've seen at least, when utilizing very well crafted rubrics, inter-rater reliability is going to go up, which is obviously something that you would like to see in your institutions.
Oh, thank you. I don't know how many people really know what inter-rater reliability means and how important that is to rubrics and assessments. So thank you. Another question that we had was, is there an available video tutorial that covers how to create these rubrics? Very, very good question.
No, yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. We have a pretty extensive user guide that covers the creation of evaluations and evaluation questions and how evaluations are assigned and structured in Leo. And there's actually a lot of flexibility, not in just the design of the rubric, but also in the way in which it's the rubric or the evaluation itself is assigned to an evaluator. And so like I said, I'm not sure if there's a video there or not, but I know we have pretty extensive documentation on creating these types of evaluations. And if you ever do need more support, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to work with you and walk you through that process.
Here at DaVinci Education, we have a whole team of former educators and people who have been in y'all's shoes before. So we're here to definitely help with any kinds of implementation questions or anything that we use. So I think with that was our last question for today. So I think that'll conclude our question answer session. And then we are, right at enough time too. So if you think of any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us individually. And we thank everybody again for attending today's webinar for Best Results Rubrics. This is the first in our For the Best Results series. So we hope all the information today that was presented was super helpful and engaging, and we'll be sure to share the recording with y'all here in an email probably tomorrow, and then we'll follow up with anybody if they have any questions individually. So thanks again, everybody, for your participation and attendance today. We really do appreciate it. Be on the lookout for some upcoming webinars in the next month or so. So just have a great rest of your Thursday and enjoy some of the time back. Thanks, y'all.